Welcome to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping Orange County. With your host, Don Camber.
Hello, live from the OC Talk Radio studios at UCI's Beal Applied Innovation Center. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Don Camber with another great guest impacting our community in a positive way. Today I welcome National Alliance on Mental Illness Orange County Board member Steve Pitman, who's also on the board of the national organization. The nonprofit is known as NAMI. Thank you, Steve, for being on Impact OC.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, Dawn.
Steve, NAMI Orange County's mission is to provide emotional support, education, and resources for families and those affected by mental illness. Please define mental illness and explain how NAMI is able to fulfill its mission.
You start off with the big questions, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit of background information. NAMI started about 40 years ago, a little over 40 years ago, by moms. And these were moms, this obviously is before the days of much computer usage. These are moms sharing letters with one another about how the so-called mental health system has failed their family members. And as they began to talk over a period of time, and I think like we're talking about a year or maybe a year and a half, somebody said, gee, it would really be great if we could all be in the same room together talking about these things. And so somehow they communicated that there were going to be a meeting, it was going to be in Minnesota, and 200 moms showed up. And these are moms that typically it was a son, sometimes a daughter, but more often than not a son, that had schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder, and because of those disorders was unable largely to work in a way that we would call normal. The mental illnesses were severe enough, it impacted their ability to get a job, to have relationships, to live independently, to do all of the things that we normally think of doing as we grow from 21 to 22 to 23. And from that started the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We started with a national organization, which still remains in Washington, D.C. We now have 48 state organizations, and we have 600 affiliates sprinkled throughout the United States. So there's virtually nowhere you can go in the United States, and if you want to talk to somebody from NAMI is there. And you have to understand that when we talk about the kind of people that NAMI serves and serves best, these are not people whose son or daughter got a little bit depressed and went in for therapy 4 or 5 times, and now they seem to be doing fine. These are people that had serious mental illness. Serious mental illness is difficult to treat at its best, but the system often fails in getting that person anywhere near the best that it can do. Typically what used to happen, it doesn't happen as much as it used to, but typically the first thing that happened is the mother is the blame for it. The schizophrenic mom, this kind of an offshoot of Freudian philosophy or theory. And when my brother went for the first time to a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist after 15 minutes turned directly to my mother and said, you do realize that you're the root source of all of his problems, don't you? Well, she hadn't ever thought of that. And then he turned to my father and said, anything she's not responsible for, you are. And my siblings were all in the room. I was not. I was in college at the time. And then he turned to my siblings and said, and anything the two of them aren't responsible for, you are, because clearly you have a dysfunctional family. That was, and when I do this presentation, when I'm talking to clinicians, they immediately say, well, when was that? And I said, well, that was in the early 60s. And typically the response I get at that point is, well, but you understand that in the 60s, that's what most of us thought. We don't think that anymore. Well, the psychiatrist that my parents had gone to was Scott Peck. He wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled, which is kind of a Bible in the mental health world. And so when the clinicians respond to me saying, well, we used to think that way, but we don't think that way anymore, then my question for them is, so why do you have his book in your bookcase? It's not in the history section. It's right there among everything else. And there is still a tendency, although I think it's waning, still a tendency to first and foremost blame mom. Hopefully we're changing that, but that's the way mental illness has been viewed for a long, long time.
So how did that evolve into NAMI?
So these moms, bless their heart, they said, we need to get organized. And so they are the ones that created the first run at it. I believe the organization's name was AMI, Alliance on Mental Illness. And then they decided it was going to be the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And they made it into a 501c3. And then states started to pick it up. And then affiliates like Orange County did as well. The Orange County affiliate has been up and flying for just under 40 years, obviously serving Orange County. And the question became one of, so as families, how do we learn enough about mental illness that we can be supportive of our family member who we love and in many ways no longer fully resembles the person that we knew with all of these different behaviors that we're seeing. And the first class, which we call a signature program, was family to family. It's taught to groups of 20 to 25 family members, led by two people who are family members. And we start off by educating them about mental illness. What does schizoaffective disorder look like? What does schizophrenia look like? What does bipolar disorder look like? How about depression? We go into all of those things. We talk a little bit about how the brain works. Having said that, we don't know a whole lot about how the brain works, because when you look at research that's funded by the federal government, much, much, much more goes into physical illnesses than goes into mental illness. One of the things I tell my class is that you remember when that plane crashed off the coast of Malaysia and they couldn't find the plane? This is a plane that's 300 feet long, 300 feet wide, the wingspan, and day after day after day, they're sending out the most sophisticated technology we have, and they can't find the plane. And we know more about the deep ocean where that plane couldn't be found than we know about the human brain. So until we start focusing on the human brain, there's going to be a lot that we don't know. And until we know those things, I think it's going to continue to be difficult to treat mental illness.
So is mental illness more or less a behavior in the brain that causes the body to act a certain way?
Well, that's an interesting way to ask the question. I would not characterize it as a behavior in the brain, but what happens is as we grow older, typically starting at around 14, the brain starts to rewire itself. And we don't know exactly why. There are a number of different theories. One of them is that as you go through your teenage years, the brain starts to know what it is being used to do. How to get home, how to do homework, all of the things that most of us do normally. In the brain of a mentally ill person, that pruning, as it's called, doesn't get the message to stop. And so the brain consolidates over time, and then you're left with something that's flawed. In the people who are healthy, that don't have a diagnosable mental illness, the pruning stops and they go forward. But again, it's an ongoing quest. It's one that will never be resolved if we don't do research, and clearly we don't do nearly enough.
Aren't there medicines to help with it?
There are also sorts of psychotropic drugs, but they are not the solution to the whole thing. Typically, a drug alone is not enough. Typically, it takes that and some sort of a behavioral intervention. It could be talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, could be other things, but typically medication alone is not enough. And frankly, talk therapy typically is not enough, usually involves medication. And these are really, really, really powerful drugs, so you have side effects, unavoidably. And, I want to be clear-minded, and I want the life that I had before, but I don't want to gain 60 pounds. And who would, frankly? And so medication compliance is always a critical issue. How do we get somebody to take the medication in small enough dosages that don't have those side effects and yet still are strong enough to help them live in a normal way.
So explain how services are provided in Orange County, and especially during COVID.
Interesting that you mentioned services. Usually that question would be mental health, something about the mental health system. And one of the things that I always say is I always hesitate to use mental health system because it sounds like there was some cognitive activity that took place when it was created, and that's not the case. We have a number of different solutions. Some work better than others, but there's no cohesion among the system. So the first time that you or your family member has a mental health break, the first thing you have to do is find a clinician. In 50% of the counties in the United States, there's not a single psychiatrist. Not one. That's a lot of people that don't have services. Orange County obviously is not like that. We have multiple psychiatrists. Typically, it takes a week or two to get in. And when you're having one of these mental health crises, your house is on fire. You want help for your family member right now.
Explain a crisis.
A crisis could be suddenly that your son is hearing voices that are unexplainable, or suddenly he is very, very agitated and much of his anger and hostility is directed at you being mom. He's never been like that before. And I don't understand what's happening. He stands out in front of our house at night and screams at the top of his lungs, not for 10 or 15 seconds, but for hours. The neighbors have called the police 15 or 20 times. They won't take him anywhere because he's not a danger to himself or others. And the only reason the police are going to take him anywhere is either he's a danger to himself or others, or he's gravely disabled. Absent one of those criteria, he can stand out in your front yard and scream and yell at 3 o'clock in the morning. And in fact, I was working with a woman recently whose son lived in an RV in front of her house. He didn't live in the home with her because she was frightened of him. So he's living in a rat-infested RV in front of her house, screaming through the night. He's punched holes in all the walls of the RV. I mean, it's a mess. As she described it, it's rat-infested. And she's doing everything in her power to get help. And there's no help coming.
So what can your organization do?
Well, we're not clinicians, but we start oftentimes by making sure the mom knows what resources are available. And there's not a long list. It's a fairly short list. And then we start talking with the mom about self-care. Because when you're that emotionally overwrought, and it's understandable why you would feel that way, it's very difficult to be making the right decisions for your son that you love so much. So we start encouraging, again, typically moms, because dads have a tendency to check out. Seriously. So the mom often is at it alone. We start talking her right from the beginning. You must take care of yourself because you won't be ready to help him when he needs it, and you won't be thinking clearly about the help he needs when he needs it if you don't first take care of yourself.
And what is taking care of yourself?
It can mean a lot of different things. You may have heard of Hans Selye. He's the father of modern-day stress theory. And the analogy that he used that makes the most sense to me is your ability to withstand stress is like a gas tank in a car. When the gas tank is full, you can do a lot of things. You can go anywhere you want because the gas tank is full. But when the gas tank is empty, you're not going anywhere, even if you want to. So the question that we ask all of our moms and dads is you have to know enough about yourself to know how you fill your gas tank. And it could be taking long walks, it could be painting, it could be meditating, it could be reading. Lots of different things will refill the gas tank, and for each person it's typically...
So once they take care of themselves, then they can take care of their son.
That's correct.
And then explain how NAMI can help.
Well, I want to finish at one point. So first you have to find out how you refill your gas tank. That's the easy part. The hard part is then you have to do it. And it's easy to talk about the fact that I feel better when I work out every day. The hard part is working out every day. So once the gas tank is full, then you can get on the phone during one of these crises and start to call people who might be able to offer some assistance. And sometimes that's a police department. When my brother was not doing well, I called the police department long before it ever got to a crisis point, because I wanted them to know that if they got called to a certain address in a certain town, that this 6'4" slender man is mentally ill. He's never hurt anyone. He doesn't own guns, so that they're kind of forewarned that they're dealing with mental illness as opposed to something else.
Getting back to NAMI, how do we get this back to NAMI?
Okay, so NAMI teaches classes. The first class I've already mentioned, the family-to-family class. We also, and that's evidence-based, incidentally. We've done research. We know it works, and it's the only one of its kind in the United States. The second thing, and not particularly in this order, we have a class called peer-to-peer. So if you have a mental illness, we encourage you to take the class. We encourage you to learn how to teach the class. So now we have people who are living with a mental illness in a class being taught by someone with mental illness. It's a little bit like the AA model, which for many people obviously has led to sobriety.
Well, there's the adage that you learn more when you teach.
Well, that's true as well. So we have a class for families, we have a class for peers, we have a class called Basics that's geared to families that have younger children. We have a provider class, a class that's taught to people who work in the mental health world. That could be an intake nurse, it could be a secretary, could be a doctor, it could be a resident, could be a nurse, and they all participate in the provider class.
And what's the youngest age that a person is diagnosed with mental illness and therefore can take advantage of NAMI programs?
That's a great question. 50% of the people who develop a mental illness are symptomatic at 14. In the United States, it takes 11 years on average before they first seek treatment. And the reason for that is that as parents, we tend to normalize the behavior of our children. Oh, Melissa is just that way, as opposed to, I wonder if there's something going on here. Now, just because she acts or behaves in ways that we don't fully understand doesn't mean that she's going to develop mental illness, but it does mean that we need to be paying attention to her behavior, and we need to be talking to a doctor. How much of a concern is this? And maybe the doctor will say nothing at all, but we need to be asking questions and looking into it.
But those with mental illness, are they responsive to being part of NAMI?
Oh, yeah, not everyone, but yes, many people. And I thought your question was going in another direction. 60% of the people with a serious mental illness have a symptom called anosognosia. And anosognosia means you have no insight into your illness. My brother was anosognostic, which meant that I couldn't sit down and have a conversation with him about the medications he needed to take because there was nothing wrong with him. And why on earth would I take those medications if there's nothing wrong with me? It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't subject yourself to chemotherapy if you didn't have cancer, and they don't subject themselves to treatment if they have a mental illness because they don't have any insight. And I used to think, if I give him, my brother had an IQ of 160 or so, and I used to think, geez, if I just give John enough information, he's going to realize he's got a really serious problem, and of course he'll take the medication. Anosognostics, it's not a lack of information. I can remember giving my brother books, and he would read the books. He could almost recite them back to you verbatim. And he'd look at me and he said, Steve, you know, I've read all the things you gave me, and I'm really okay. And then he would say, but I am really worried about you. And he would take his medications and slide them across the table, suggesting that I take them. 60% of the people with serious mental illness behave just exactly like that. And you can talk until you're blue in the face, and more often than not, they will never acknowledge that they have a mental illness.
So do many people go to NAMI because they have loved ones in that situation?
That's exactly why they come to NAMI. They're looking for answers, and they're not getting much or many through the system itself. So, you know, they come to NAMI in search of answers, and the first class we teach is 12 weeks, 2.5 hours once a week. And in the beginning, they think, Lord, how can I spend 2.5 hours doing this for 12 weeks? And by the end of the class, they're thinking, what are we going to do now? We have to stay in touch. So after those classes terminate, we have support groups, both for the family members and also for the people living with a mental illness.
Thank you, National Alliance on Mental Illness Orange County Board Member Steve Pittman, who's also on the board of the national organization, for being on Impact OC. And I thank everyone for tuning in. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Dawn Camber. Have an impactful day.
You've been listening to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping our community. Right here on Orange County's only community radio station, OC Talk Radio.